a lot of people are going to be surprised at how much they really enjoy this game, because it's just really well done for most players. Can you talk us through some of the basics of PoE 2, like the classes, skills, UI, etc.? Sure. So classes, they're, from what we know confirmed so far, there are at least 6 classes on the early access, which arrives December 6th. On November 21st, there will be a live stream that will occur that fills us in on more information for the 6th, including how to get access, etc., and if there's price points and how to get in, etc. On December 6th comes the launch of the game, and the 6 classes we know confirmed so far are Sorceress, Ranger, Witch, Warrior, Mercenary, and Monk so far. Now, just because there's a class in the game does not mean you are locked to skills for that class. Path of Exile is notable for having skills that work across the board. So you can use a warrior skill on a ranger or a ranger skill on a warrior, to give you an example. The skills are actually locked behind weapon types, not behind class types, meaning there's a mace skill, and if you have a mace skill, you cannot use a mace skill on like a two-handed axe skill. Does that make sense? So because of that, you want to kind of choose the weapon type you're using in order to associate skills around it. Now, there are other requirements for skills outside of just weapons. Some of the most notable ones would be things like attributes. So there are different attributes: strength, dexterity, intelligence. And if you're running a warrior, you're more likely to have like strength associated stats in order to be able to use the skills that are most often associated with a class like warrior. For instance, strength. When you play warrior, you're probably someone who wants to play with like a two-handed axe or mace. You probably want a lot of armor, and you're probably thinking about using big slam type of moves, and those things require strength, for instance, as a requirement. Now, the cool thing about the passive tree in Path of Exile 2 is it's different than the passive tree in Path of Exile 1. In Path of Exile 1, your skill tree is determined upon your starting location for the class, which is the same in Path of Exile. Your starting location will determine upon where you're at in the skill tree. You have access to all the skills if you choose to navigate throughout the skill tree. But the smaller nodes that are in between the nodes that are like damage, HP, notable nodes, and maybe change fundamental mechanics about the game, the small nodes that in Path of Exile 1 would normally have strength or intelligence or dexterity, depending upon where you're on the tree, are actually variable in Path of Exile 2. So when you click on one of those travel nodes, is very often what they're called, a node that just gives you raw attributes, you can actually choose to decide which of those stats they are going to give you. So give you an example of this. In Path of Exile 1, often there's a requirement for like intelligence to use like Frostblink, a travel skill. If we use that same example in Path of Exile 2, instead of having to like travel to get like an intelligence node so you can use that, you can just use one of the nodes, and instead of transforming that into strength, you can just make that an intelligence one, for instance, to get around this type of issue. So there's those types of attribute requirements are similar with gear as well. So if you want to use something like a bow, you're going to need dexterity. If you want to use something like a hammer, you're going to need strength. And because of this, the variability, or flexibility probably be a better word, for those travel nodes are actually really nice to have in Path of Exile 2, because it makes it significantly easier for you to be able to access and use equipment and skills throughout the entirety of Path of Exile 2. Now, in Path of Exile 1, you could still use any gear and equipment. You just had to make sure you had the attributes, but it was a little bit more min-maxy, because you got to make sure, okay, well, I have to put 2 points here to get this intelligence. There's a little bit more of an annoying side of the game of it. And something they've done in Path of Exile 2 is they are specifically trying to remove a lot of what they consider like annoying or unnecessary parts of Path of Exile. One such concept would be the idea that colored sockets are actually a good idea. They're reneging on this. They're actually removing color-based sockets from Path of Exile 1 when they drop into Path of Exile 2. All sockets are now effectively white sockets, meaning you can put any skill gem in any socket. You don't have to worry about whether or not it's a red, a green, or a blue gem, and therefore chroma orbs don't exist within Path of Exile 2. Another example of this would be like sockets themselves. Speaking of sockets, actually don't exist on gear at all. They exist on within your character. So there's a skill, a socket tree you open up, and you unlock sockets, and you have a certain amount of them you'll have available. And then all of the skills will upgrade and unlock more and more support sockets for each one of the skills. Meaning all of the skills in Path of Exile 2 have the ability to have a 6 socket associated with them. You are no longer required to only have a certain amount of 6 sockets. You can maximize all of your skills. One of the focuses of Path of Exile 2 has been significantly more focused on making sure you're using a variety of moves. You might very often see in Path of Exile 1 people are only using like one move to spam, spam. You're going to notice in the gameplay they show and the conversations they have, they're much more focused on, I use this ability, which sets me up to be able to use this ability. And the second ability interacts with the first one in a way that does X, Y, Z. An example of this, for instance, would either be like the Druid, where you put down the volcano and then you smash around as the bear, which makes the volcano erupt with more projectiles. Or in the example of the monk, like you're seeing on your screen here, there would be, I place a bell and then I hit the bell with electricity, making the bell itself an electric bell. And now everything around that bell is going to have, you know, electrical damage and associated with it. So these combo style gameplay is a little bit, I say a little bit, but it's significantly different from the hyper min-max use one ability style of Path of Exile 1. Part of that is because in Path of Exile 1, you're limited on how many abilities you can really have 6 socket. Normally 2 is your maximum because the chest plate and the weapon are the only abilities that can actually have 6 socket, but like I stated again in Path of Exile 2, that is due to change. But it's also part of the reason that you see people mention things like, okay, well, Path of Exile 2 is looking slower because what they're trying to do is focus on the gameplay where you do this to do this and that makes this happen, as opposed to I hold my button, how much damage is my one button doing? They're actually focused on a little bit more interactive, dynamic gameplay and a little bit less of min-maxy gameplay. I think there's a number of reasons that they're going in this direction. I think most of them have to do with the demographic they're targeting and trying to widen out the player base. I think that when we see some of the criticisms and feedback for Path of Exile 1 in my time looking at the game, and even when I was learning the game myself, it does feel a little weird to be like, you have one ability, now spend 1,000 hours making that one ability really good. So much to the point that we see people, you know, focus, and not to call out Pox, but like he's a great example of someone who's spent basically his entire life in Path of Exile making one ability really, really good. So much so that he knows it so much that he's the expert for like that one ability. I don't know if they're necessarily against this as a concept for games, because this is a fundamental part of ARPGs just in general, where you're going to try to get one ability that's the strongest, that's your main ability, and because multipliers are a thing and support skills are a thing, you're going to try to make the one ability do the most damage as possible. This same concept is still going to exist in Path of Exile 2, and it's just fundamentally an ARPG concept. But in Path of Exile 1, this concept exists to such an extent that you're just seeing one ability cover the entire screen all of the time, one-shotting everything. And I think they kind of want to tone it down a little bit more to be focused on what your character and class are doing, as opposed to just one ability itself is doing. And so as a byproduct of that, in Path of Exile 1, a whole screen full of mobs dies in one button push, but in Path of Exile 2, the fact that you're even using multiple skills itself innately makes the game slower, because if you have a mob there, and I'm going to do one ability to set up another ability, even if the second ability one-shots that mob, for instance, then you're still using 2 abilities, which is still longer than one button press that's probably really fast and you just teleport right in the middle of them literally anyway. So that's probably part of the reason you see feedback related to the speed of the game. One other point is they're kind of changing the focus a little bit of the maps and the length of time you'll be grinding in each individual portion of the game, because it's procedurally generated and all that, and you're going through and there's a bunch of mobs you're fighting. But in Path of Exile 1, you spend probably 80-90% of your time in each one of the maps or zones fighting through the monster to get to the boss, and then the boss is kind of just like a souped up monster that dies fairly quickly. If you have a good build, you're blasting through, you get to the end boss dies almost immediately as well. But in Path of Exile 2, they're changing the percentage of that more, where it's about 30, 40%, probably more like 35% of the time the total that you're going to spend in the map is on the boss. So not to say that the bosses are necessarily damage sponges, like it doesn't really feel like there's just this huge target on me that takes forever for me to fight, but more so kind of what you see from boss fights like Shaper or Maven, where there's either phases or mechanics you're trying to avoid. They want the end boss and the end result of the map to be, you're getting through the mobs and you're clearing out the mobs, but then you get to a boss and there's an actual fight, as opposed to we're just mob density, how many can we kill, crank up the mob density, blast through everything, the boss is gone in the blink of an eye. And that is akin partly to probably why you're seeing things like the combo changes, etc., because combos may not feel as satisfying on mobs when you have a smaller mob density of 5, 6, 7 mobs that are there, as opposed to 700 mobs that are on your screen, and you do a combo to clear them out. But it will feel pretty good on a boss that has a bigger HP chunk and it's taking you a while to chunk them down, but you set up a big combo, and then you land that big combo, and his health goes boom down the lot. You're like, okay, I actually did a lot of damage right there. So that is something that I noticed as well when I was testing and doing boss fights, is that the combos, or maybe my main primary move that I've used so much, very often they're one-shotting a significant amount of the mobs, but you really feel that combination and kind of enjoyability of setting up a combo a lot more on the bosses itself. So I don't know if it's necessarily going to bum people out. I understand when I see people are talking about the gameplay slow. I mean, you can see this. This is my couch co-op gameplay with my good buddy Jay Giggs from Australia here back in the day when we were testing the Monk couch co-op gameplay. It's about 5 months old gameplay you're watching here. So things have changed a little bit. But, you know, that's 5 mobs right there. Obviously, we're kind of noobs at the game at this point, and we're picking through. But you can see the mob density is lower, but it doesn't feel bad, if that makes sense. You know, even in Path of Exile 1, the first couple acts, there's significantly more mobs, etc. But the way that they've designed the game around this is, I was kind of talking about audience demographics earlier, and I think part of the reason for the demographic they're looking at is, one, you're going to have couch co-op, console play, cross progression. And they're trying to make it more appealing to people. You'll notice that in the gameplay footage they've done, it's like, let me introduce the witch class. Let me introduce the warrior class. And you might ask yourself, if you're a Path of Exile 1 enjoyer, why so much are they talking about classes? Classes don't really mean that much in Path of Exile typically, because when you're picking a class, it only is really for your ascendancy, which we don't really know too much about yet, or your starting position on the map. So why all the talk about classes and the skills related to the classes? I think they're trying to sell you on themes and concepts of characters, because there's a large demographic out there that doesn't understand Path of Exile, and they can't really come out there and say, like, okay, well, here's class 1, here's class 2. It doesn't really matter, however, because all skills can be used in all classes. Like, they can't really sell pitches at that. So they're trying to sell you, like, power fantasies. Here's a big warrior with a big hammer, etc. Because I do think that with the style of game they're going with the gameplay we've seen, with the combination changes like I'm talking about, the focus on more enjoyable boss fights, the couch co-op, the cross progression, we're going to see a significant amount of the population in Path of Exile 2 are more than likely people that have never even picked up Path of Exile 1 ever. In my own personal opinion, I think we're going to see, I would go as high as like 70-80% of people playing Path of Exile 2. Maybe not necessarily on December 6th, on like the early access, paid, you know, access sort of release. But when the game fully launches, is free to play on all platforms, and maybe they do some marketing, etc., I think we're going to see an absolutely enormous spike in the amount of new players that we see. And I think a lot of those players are actually going to be console players. And console on Path of Exile 1, I don't think is typically, you know, too fantastic. But in Path of Exile 2, it's one of the first games I've played with a controller where I'm actually debating playing it with a controller, because it actually plays just really well on a controller, and is obviously designed not with console as a forefront, but with console in mind. And I think they do a really exceptional job of both teaching those new players with that demographic in mind, designing the gameplay, the boss fights, the new like combination type of system, and the class themes with new players in mind as well. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing new people get into it and starting to enjoy it, because of some of the, like I was mentioning with chroma orbs being removed, some of the previous knowledge requirements are going to be more limited. You're not going to need to really know anything about the game previously to be able to play it. Also, something they've done is even for the little bits of knowledge you might need, like you're even going to notice on the footage here, like life is underlined or evasion's underlined or, you know, fire's underlined. They actually have almost like a built-in wiki system where what you can do is you can hover over the word, for instance. You can hover over where it says fire or resistance or something like that. And what it's going to do is if there's a video for that, they're actually going to pop up a video showcasing either the skill, if you're hovering over skill gem, what it actually, you know, visually looks like, as well as an explanation for how it works. So maybe you don't know what chaos damage is. Maybe you don't know what damage over time is. Maybe you don't know where resistances are. You hover over these words, and it has like a built-in explanation. So, I mean, how many of us have actually used the Path of Exile, you know, one built-in game help book? I don't think I've ever even opened it. But in Path of Exile 2, it's more readily available. It's much better explained, and it's more visually readable in the game. And I think a lot of that is with console in mind, because if you're on the computer, what you can do is open up your browser very easily, and you can see in the browser, here's all these websites, links, streams are open, all of these things to explain what you need to know. But on the console, you're not so much that way. And if you have another screen, you're probably watching Netflix on the other screen, and then your primary screen, you're playing the game. And, you know, you're not really going to pull up your phone and maybe like Google something. Like, you're probably just going to play the game because you're sitting on your couch playing on the TV, and you're not really going to read text on the TV, you know, too much. So they have to make it kind of big and in your face and visual and all that. And that's something I've just noticed. So I constantly see all of these things they're doing in changes to the style of the game, the pacing of the game, the combat system in the game, the focus on bosses, the readability, removing unnecessary like information bloat that you don't really need, annoying parts of the game being removed, you know, refining. I would say dumbing down, but I don't think it's dumbing down as much as refining is a better word of the game. It's almost like a remastering of the original. So I think a lot of people are going to like it. I mean, in closing, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised at how much they really enjoy this game, because it's just really well done for most players. And hopefully that answers your question on a general rundown of Path of Exile 2.